Welcome to today's Bible webinar on how Newcastle is using data and AI to reduce energy costs and prioritize interventions. As demand for automation, AI, and electrification surges and carbon regulations tighten, both public and private property owners face mounting uncertainty around energy supply, price volatility, and investment prioritization. The aim of today's webinar is to provide some of the evidence for how technologies are being used to improve urban life and to inspire your next smart journey, whether you have an explicit mandate for smart or you need to know how digital innovation can better support your work. I am Peter Griffith. I lead Barbel's UKI team. Barbel works with cities and companies across Europe with the aim of helping places transition to more resilient and sustainable futures. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today. So later on, you'll meet David Truesdale, Principal Advisor for Climate Change and Sustainability at Newcastle City Council, and Joe Leach, Senior Engineer at Semanalytica. They'll share a practical example of how integrating place-based data and simulation has been used to help target the most cost-effective interventions. After that, I will host a short conversation, which you're welcome to be part of, about how AI and advanced data sciences can help cities and portfolio managers make faster, smarter energy decisions. Just before I hand over to David and Joe, I'd like to use this slide to provide some context for today's discussion. Barbel tracks innovation spending and projects across Europe to better understand the demand for new solutions. This chart shows a top-level innovation focus for cities across Europe. Energy and buildings are two of the biggest focus areas, followed by ICT, which is the sector responsible for much of the brilliant number crunching Semanalytica does. Alongside this, we will also be doing running a short seminar to understand your biggest areas of challenge when it comes to buildings and energy. We will come back to these during the panel discussion around halfway through this webinar, but feel free to answer this question at any time in the chat. You're of course welcome to add questions into chat for us to explore during the panel too. David and Joe, over to you. You're very welcome to take ownership of the slides from here.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, welcome everyone today. So I've just got a bit of a short slide here to bring a little bit of context to Newcastle. So I'm the Principal Advisor for Climate at Newcastle City Council, and my role is very much focused on delivering net zero and climate change projects across the council. So we have a net zero 2030 action plan. Like many local authorities in 2019, we declared a climate emergency. And as part of that, we worked to develop a climate action plan that was developed in September 2020. Off the back of that, we now have a programme of work that effectively looks to delivery of various climate activities and actions up until 2030. As a city, we have about 320,000 people living here in the northeast of England. As you can see in the picture there, one of our sort of key pieces of infrastructure in the city is the Tyne Bridge, which is almost coming to its 100th year anniversary. And the city was very much the birthplace, or one of the birthplaces in the UK for the Industrial Revolution. And that is really important and something that we're really proud of. But obviously, it also is something that we recognise has a very big impact from a climate perspective, in the sense that Newcastle was known for its coal, known for its sort of delivery of coal to the rest of the UK. But obviously that had a very, very, very high carbon emission factor to it. So as a city, we don't just feel proud about it because we need to respond to the here and now. We almost feel like we have a bit of a historical obligation to it. So that sets a bit of the context. But for us, our strategy around delivering net zero and tackling climate change isn't one that we just put on the shelf and focus on looking at every so often. It's something that runs through the core of our entire council. So we have a regular net zero board, we deliver various programs across the space. And the areas at the bottom of the screen are our key key thematic areas that we focus on. So what I'll do is I'll talk through a couple of those really briefly, and then I'll settle on the final one, which is energy and heat, which is the thematic area where the project with Sim Analytica helped us gain real insight into our network. So obviously, as a local authority, we have a really important role in terms of engaging with our residents. So governance and engagement is a key part of our ongoing delivery. So what that means is we're responsible for our ongoing reporting structure to track progress against our net zero action plan, tracking our emission reductions that we've seen an 11% reduction since 2020, which is really good. But since 2005, we've seen an even bigger reduction, 42%. And also, how do we engage with our residents in the city? We also track. I've got transport twice there. Transport is very important. It's about 30% of our emissions, but what the other one should actually say is waste. So transport is obviously a really important area. So how do we push EV infrastructure? How do we encourage our bus network to transition to electric? And how do we support our residents to change their behaviours and at least try and reduce the amount of car journeys into the city and using public transport, active travel and the like? So transport's critical, as is waste. How do we encourage our city to recycle more? How do we encourage it to send less stuff to landfill? And that also falls into the remit. And of course, adaptation in nature is also critical to it. So how do we green the city? How do we put more green infrastructure into it? How do we manage blue infrastructure? So things that relate to the water and water flow into the Tyne. How do we reduce the flow of water or the speed of water flow so that the Tyne doesn't become inundated, as has happened in the past, especially around the quayside? So that's a really important point. A couple of thematic areas, but one of the critical ones for us is energy and heat. So energy and heat generates about 65% of the city's emissions. And it's an area that we're trying to find innovative and different ways of tackling the challenge. And for us, the challenge is relatively simple. The solutions are hard, or not hard, but complex. But the challenge is very much, how do we decarbonise? How do we remove gas from our city? How do we shift to more electric? How do we generate more renewables locally? And how do we drive all of that? And a key part of that is understanding our properties. It's about understanding the ones that we own as a council, the ones that we manage. We have something stupid like 2,000 assets that we as a council manage specifically. And of those, about 126 are sort of big buildings or on recognisable buildings. A lot of the assets are things like little green spaces and war memorials and things like that, which you can't really decarbonise, obviously, but we have the responsibility of. But those 126 buildings are ones that are at the core of our communities and the city. So it could be everything from leisure centres and respite centres for adult social care and children's services, all the way through to the building I'm sitting in today, which is our civic centre, which is obviously the heart of our local authority. And all of those buildings generate tons of carbon in various ways, shapes and forms. And for us, it's all about how do we decarbonise those buildings cost effectively, and also focusing on what the benefits are. So how can we improve the energy efficiency of those buildings? How can we make those buildings more pleasant for people to be in? How can we use renewables on their roof spaces to cut our reliance on power we buy from the grid? How can we use things like heat pumps? And all of these things are really complicated. They're not new challenges. A lot of them have been floating around for the past 10, 15, even 20 years. But the challenge we find now that a number of funding streams like PSDS has sort of wound up is the business case piece is even more important than it was maybe a year or two ago, which means that we have to really be clear on how do we prioritise the buildings that we focus on, how do we prioritise the funding that we're securing in terms of whether it's borrowing powers or through remaining funding streams that exist, and how do we also just target the right buildings, the right place in the city so that they have an impact. All of those things are really hard, and there's a myriad of data sources floating around. We're really fortunate we have a really good picture the baseline of what our buildings are telling us in terms of the amount of energy usage, the amount of gas usage, and their efficiency levels. The bit that we struggle at is how do we take all of that data and move at pace to sort of almost generate quick outline business cases that are now allows us to prioritize the areas or the buildings that we should focus on first, and then work with our internal teams to then secure the funding. And that's an area where we worked with Analytica to develop a proof of concept that we're actively now working towards expanding across the region with our other 6 LAs in the Northeast Combined Authority. But it's very much around how do we take that data, how do we sort of outline business case quickly at scale, and prioritize our focus areas so that we can get the biggest bang for our buck in investing in our assets, but also delivering the biggest cost and energy savings and emission savings. So I think that's probably a really good point to hand over to yourself, Joe. Obviously, I'll be taking some further questions as part of the session. So thank you so much. And over to you, Joe.
Thank you, David. So just a bit of context about myself. So I'm a senior software engineer, and as part of this project, I was the technical lead, so leading on the technical delivery. I worked closely with David on scoping out exactly what we needed, trying to understand more around the problem statements and just understanding a bit of the pain. David, some points were probably a bit of a therapy session as you laid it all out for us. But yeah, what I'd like to do now is David's done a great job of talking us through the what and the why. I'd like to just talk a bit more now around the how we actually achieve this. So we can step through some high-level solutions, high-level architecture. We can run through a few examples, and then we'll just revisit the original solution that we laid out as well, just seeing if we have actually delivered on what we said. So what I'll do now is then just come across to this next slide. So David's touched on a few different bits there, and I've just tried to summarize exactly what that actually means. So the high-level categories that I could pull out of that were, it was overwhelmed by data. There's a vast amount of data out there. Some is useful, some is not, different quality of data. In this example, we're looking at thousands of different buildings from your asset list, David. There's literally tons of different retrofit options we might do across those buildings as well. And then on top of that, we've got a range of contextual data. So then we can come across and start looking at what kind of questions do we need to ask of this data as well. So which interventions do we need to target? Which buildings are we looking at? What's the cost and return on those investments as well? So we've got data, we've got questions, and then it's how do we actually use that data and how do we use those questions? So we have quite a lot of disconnected processes. So there's analysis happening in multiple different tools, whether that's in Excel spreadsheets, whether you're using some kind of geospatial tool to contextualize that data. And then the reporting sometimes happens in different tools as well. So whether this is specific for this project or it's rinse and repeat for a lot of different LAs or different companies out there, there is a lot of disconnected processes from the reporting side. And then it's also time consuming trying to unify those different insights as well. So the final one here I'll just touch on as well is just looking at the constraints that we see. So each of these here, the vast amount of data, the number of questions we're asking, the different processes that we have, it's also limited by the constraints that we have. So there's limited time to answer these questions. There might be limited staff availability to work on these questions, and then there might be a limited budget on top of that as well. So how do we start bridging the gap and making sure we have a tool that we can quite quickly get to an answer of these questions? And it might be that we still need to double click afterwards, but can we actually get to an answer within an hour, within a couple of minutes, rather than it taking months, weeks, or days? Like, what, trying to actually condense that timeline to actually get to an answer quicker. So just going to run through a high-level solution here of what we were trying from the outset, what we actually wanted to try and achieve. So the initial thing was simplifying the complexity. So disconnected data and analysis, it can be quite scary when you're first looking at it. When we came into this project, David, there was so much different data we could actually include. There was different analysis we could do on top of that. And end users don't necessarily want to see endless spreadsheets. It's super useful when we're actually trying to get to the answer. But when it comes to, David, you touched on stakeholder engagement, people don't necessarily want to see a spreadsheet at the end of the day. It's definitely got its use and we definitely need them, but the end user doesn't necessarily need to see it, especially if they're signing off on budget. Some pretty pictures in there can go a long way to help with that. So then we can come across and look at how we unify and focus as well. So we're bringing data into a single platform and we only surface what's relevant for that decision making. Again, I'm going to keep touching on spreadsheets here because it was quite prevalent in this project. You might have a spreadsheet with 5 different sheets within it. Each one's got 10 different columns. One of those columns might be relevant for what you're actually trying to do, whether you're looking at electricity consumption, gas consumption, or a carbon reduction, whatever it might be. There's only one column there, but if you go into the spreadsheet, you're seeing all of that information. And then just building on that as well, how do we abstract away that technical detail? So how do we actually look at keeping the flows grounded in what the user actually needs? And then we can start looking at hiding that additional complexity as well behind the scenes. It's still happening, but the user doesn't need to know that it's happening. And then how do we also look at empowering everyone? So rather than it being a static report that is delivered, can we actually allow the stakeholders to come in and actually play around with the tool and actually understand a bit more around how we're actually getting to those answers? So this might be seeing the visuals back onto the map. It might be seeing an automated dashboard. It might be playing around and building your own scenarios where you don't have to worry about messing up the figures in the original data. And then I'd just like to look at a high level. What does the architecture look like? How can we actually get to this solution? And bear with me while I explain this one. So I was trying to think of a good way that we could actually talk through and explain what we're trying to do here. So if we start at the bottom here, we've got lots of different data and the data can be quite scary. We've got ETL here. ETL, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially it's how we would actually process the data. How do we take those original spreadsheets, transform it into a format that we can actually use within these projects, essentially standardizing and making sure we can interchange between different formats. On top of that, we're doing some kind of analysis. This could be AI, it could be some standard statistics, whatever we need to get to the answer. And then what the user actually cares about is what's on the surface of the water here. So by the time it gets to the end user, we're looking at rainbows and butterflies, essentially, is how we can take this one. So what I'm trying to get across here is just because there's a lot going on behind the scenes that might be intimidating to an end user, we can expose only what is needed. We can expose those dashboards, those maps, those different ways of viewing the information that are actually useful for getting to an answer. So we've looked at a high level solution here. I'd just like to talk a bit around how our platform actually works. So we should see commonalities back to that previous diagram here. But what we try and do is start out with a data foundation. So David touched on, they've got quite a lot of data available in this area and some really, really useful data as well. Some that we've integrated into the initial work and some that we can see where it could actually slot in the future as well. Just to talk through a few examples, like I've already touched quite a few times already on spreadsheets here, but then we could also start looking at bringing in reports as well. Can we actually extract information from reporting? Can we start bringing in GIS layers as well? And also we can touch on sensors as well. So in the initial POC piece, we didn't necessarily need to bring in any live information from sensors, but if we wanted to look at local air quality, if we have any information that's been emitted by the buildings themselves, how do we actually start bringing that into a single environment as well? So we always start out just with a data foundation before we even know necessarily what the analysis is. Can we get the data into the platform? We then have our own implementation of a knowledge graph on top. And I'm not going to talk too much around knowledge graphs today, but what we can just explain it as is think about each of these different data sets. In some way, they might be related together. How do we start building up relationships between those different layers of data? You might have a building data set. How is that related to the road data set? How is that related to the assets within the building? And we can start building up structured relationships between them, where it explains how we can do analysis between those different layers as well. On top of that, we can then pick and choose what kind of analysis and AI and simulation that we use on the platform. Again, building on top of that knowledge graph. Do we need to just do some standard statistical analysis on top of it? Do we need to do any modeling? Whether we need to pull in a transport simulation, whether we're doing modeling based on the spreadsheets, how do we bring that into a single environment? And then on top of that as well, how do we augment those flows with AI as well? and that's only where it's actually needed, not putting it in for the sake of putting it in. We only include the AI if we actually need it and it benefits the end user. And then how we actually expose this is where we get into the sunshine and rainbows at the end of that previous diagram. How do we expose that into a intuitive environment that allows the user to play around with the data and actually see it in a way that makes sense to them? And then finally, I'll just include this bit as well. Won't touch too much on it, but just the different ways. It's almost like a jigsaw where we can pull in what's relevant, whether it's that analysis again, simulation, whether it's data warehousing, whether it's pipelines, etc., etc. Just seeing how in the future we can actually extend this as well and build on top of that platform. So that's kind of how we start out in terms of our platform and what we can actually build on top of. And David, what we work together to actually look at how we expose an application on top of this platform. Now, what we will do is just quickly touch on, I mentioned just then around AI and how we only want to include it where it's actually needed. There's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, and everyone seems to be trying to cram it into tools. What we'd like to do is take a step back and make sure we're actually providing value with the AI as well. So I've put here AI to enhance, not replace. So how do we actually use it to help shape the direction and uncover insights for an end user? How do we simplify complexity rather than add to it? There's a lot of tools out there nowadays where AI is being added in, but it might actually add to the complexity rather than actually benefiting the end user. Again, what we're trying to do here is find how it can actually be applied and why it should be applied rather than just doing it. So when we started out, we didn't even necessarily, I don't think we spoke about AI for quite a while, David. It was more so understanding those flows, understanding what kind of analysis and what we needed to expose to an end user. And then after the fact, when we understood these are the nuances within these data flows, then we can actually revisit, is AI relevant here? How do we actually include it within the tool? And I know we're in an AI chat today, but it's always important to bear in mind that it doesn't necessarily need to be used everywhere. It's finding where it can actually add that value at the end of the day. So here I've just mentioned, not everything needs to be AI. It's about using it where it does add that real value. So what I'd like to do now is just come across and then look at a couple of examples that we pulled together in the tool itself. So we'll start by asking a high-level question that we wanted to answer. So David, we talked about in the initial days of the project, how do we actually get to an answer in terms of gas consumption? How do we look at electricity consumption? Maybe it's operational cost. How do we get to the point of answering those questions in an easy to use way where it's not necessarily the people that have full domain knowledge? How does someone with less experience using the tools also do that? Essentially, how does someone that doesn't want to look at a spreadsheet surface these answers within the tool as well? So in this example here, we would like to understand the top buildings by gas consumption and then view them back onto a map. So the reality right now would be looking at the asset list spreadsheet for the highest consumptions, pulling out the UPRNs from that data set, which is the unique identifiers for each of the buildings, finding the correlated building outlines, attach the electricity data, upload everything back into a mapping tool, finally view it on a map, realize we actually wanted to look at the top 10, not the top 5. And then we also might have the fun email where you get an automated bounce because your team lead from the GIS you're working with is now on leave for the next 2 weeks. You may have also noticed here that I mentioned at the top gas consumption. You may have made a mistake in the flow as well. You started off with gas consumption. It was lost in translation. You ended up with electricity consumption. And these are all bits that we can start playing around with and looking at how we automate how we ask these questions. And everyone's going to be in a different point with this. David, some of this is relevant to you. Some of it we can also pull from other projects as well. You might be starting out where you already have your buildings on a map with the electricity consumption, with the gas consumption. You might be starting out where you don't even know the consumption of these different buildings. Everyone's going to be at a different phase. But how do we start automating some of those flows and making it easier and reducing that time to an answer? So that's the reality. I'd just like to show an example now of how we could do it within the tool. So I've just said here, or we could just ask the question. If we were to ask this in real life, I would go to David and say, David, what are the top buildings by gas consumption? What's stopping us doing that using a tool as well? So now this is just a quick video I threw together from the tool itself. We exposed an assistant within the tool that all of the different data layers that we pulled into the tool, you can then ask questions on top of it. So in this case, I just want to replicate the question we just asked, which was, what were the top 5 assets by gas consumption? Here we can see the different buildings that were highlighted. So we've got some heat stations there, we've got a couple of schools, and then we've got a couple of other buildings as well. So we can see the information augmented into the side panel. We can also see the information back onto the map as well. But then if we decided actually it's the top 10 assets we care about, not the top 5, we're not starting the analysis from scratch again. We're just asking the updated question. So there we've updated the map, we've updated the side panel with the aggregated information. And what we can do is start asking additional questions as well. So we've looked at this data. We've identified the top buildings. Maybe we need to double click on one of those buildings now. So in this example here, we can see Benfield School at the bottom. Maybe we're focusing on educational institutions. So what we want to do here is just ask, can you give me the additional information around Benfield School? Again, that can go away, look at the data we have under the hood, and I'll just emphasize how good the data is that David, you were able to provide as part of this project as well. But what we can do here is surface not just the electricity consumption, gas consumption, but also look at overall carbon. And then we can use this as the base point to then start asking additional questions as well. So we've identified a building we want to look at. Maybe we're still looking at the entire portfolio, but without having to go to a spreadsheet, without going to several different tools, we can quite quickly get to the point where we're actually answering a question with the tool. And this is another base point that we can start building on top of for that analysis piece. Now that we know that we want to look at Benfield School, can we start asking questions on top of that? So that's more so looking just at a contextual piece. Again, just where we want to start doing analysis on top of. I'd just like to now look at a second example where we're starting to look a bit more at that intervention side. How do we start building up scenarios, looking at how we might want to spend a budget within the tool? So again, I'll just go through the current reality of how a lot of people are doing this. We're basically starting with the same bits that we've done in that previous flow. How do we get the information? So we're looking at spreadsheets, we're looking at UPRNs, we're looking at maps. We might have to pull some information from reports as well. We then have to define a set of assumptions manually for each of the scenarios. What are we including? What are we not including for each of the buildings, each of the scenarios, each of the retrofit interventions? We then need to recalculate the energy, carbon, cost estimates, whether that's by hand. It might be through another tool in another spreadsheet. Pull the outputs from that into a separate report or a separate dashboard. Repeat the process for each of the new scenarios as well. So if we want to make any comparisons, we're doing that manual process each of the times. And then we end up where we're trying to compare results across multiple different files, systems, formats, etc. And what we'd like to explore with this next example is just how we might go about, again, simplifying that flow. So here, I'm just going to quickly talk over it. We have different prioritizations. We can enter a budget. So imagine in this example, we have £1 million budget, and then we might want to look at scenarios considering all of the assets, or we might want to look at a subset of assets. I've just left it with all of them. It can go away and figure out what's the best way to spend that money. So here, of the £1 million budget, we spent 995,000 of it. And then what we can come in here is just have a look at how that information is broken down. So we talked about Benfield School here before. This example has said that we're going to install cavity wall insulation for Benfield School, but we can also see each of the other buildings that are included with it alongside the interventions. And again, just because we've used an automated way of generating that budget, there's nothing stopping us manually tweaking that afterwards. This is, again, just trying to reduce that time to an answer. So once you're happy with a configuration, you can come through and start actually exploring your scenarios as well, whether you're looking at installation cost saving, energy saving, carbon saving, etc. Just exposing that, again, back onto a map, but then also within the actual KPI breakdowns as well. So side panel can show us the current asset. It can show us the local authority district level. For example, David, if you're looking at the entire portfolio, across Newcastle. But then also, how do we start bringing back that stakeholder engagement piece as well? So maybe people want to see their actual house within 3D as a satellite image rather than just a 2D map. And finally, what we can do is also bring that information back into a report as well. So the stakeholder engagement piece is good, where you can click around, see the map, but then when it comes to actually extracting information, can we start looking at how we would actually build up an automated report at the end of it? So just a couple of bits on here. We can see the breakdown of the different assets that we're doing, and then also the interventions that we're applying across the top. We also have the key figures in terms of how many assets, how many interventions, and how many unique interventions were applied. So 5 unique interventions, and there were a total of 8 interventions across the board. I know I've run across that quite quickly. I wanted to keep it quite quick in terms of when we were showing the tool here today. If anyone does want to see this in a bit more detail or double click, I'm more than happy to run over that as well. But for today, I just wanted to give you a couple of snippets of what the tool looks like, how we can start answering questions with it, and hopefully you might be able to see how we're not necessarily just using AI for the sake of it. We're trying to look at how we can augment those flows and make sure that it's actually adding value rather than just including it for the sake of including it. So what I'd like to do now is just revisit what we set out to do in terms of the solution. So what we wanted to do is simplify the complexity. So bringing in several different disconnected data sets, and then also looking at how we can actually integrate analysis on top of that, how we can abstract away from those spreadsheets, how can we actually bring it into an environment that's a bit more intuitive to use, might have a 15 minutes or so playing around and trying to familiarize yourself. But once you're in there, you can play around, see what works for you, see which interventions you want to apply, maybe scroll to your house on the map and see what it looks like in 3D, whatever you want to do. And then we can also look at how we unified and focused. We're bringing it back into the single platform. We're only trying to surface the relevant information. So whether that's looking at the KPIs, whether it's looking at, for example, the energy saving, the carbon saving, the cost saving, or if it's even just looking at the installation costs as well. If you're on a fixed budget, we need to keep that in mind as well. It might be for a specific grant or however you're actually funding the interventions, making sure we can actually see how we're spending that money moving forward. And then also abstracting the technical details. So it's kind of captured by the previous ones, but just keeping the user flows grounded in what matters. We're starting out with some contextual data. We're running some kind of analysis on top, and then surfacing that back into an intuitive environment where we can see a map-based view. We've got some charting, we've got some KPIs, but then also automated reporting off the back of that as well. And then just trying to empower whoever we can as well. So David, you and your team, you've already started playing around with this tool. I could see in the future how you might actually be able to pass that round wider in within the local authority as well. It's not necessarily just grounded in people that know all the technical details. Anyone should hopefully be able to come in and have a play with that. And that's my opinion on it. So David, I'd now like to just hand back to you and just pose a couple of questions to you. So did we meet those goals? Has that solution delivered on what we set out to do? What does it mean in practice as well? So how can you actually use a tool like this? How is it adding that value? And then just opening it back up to where do we go from here as well? How could you see this tool being used, or how can we extend it in the future?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so going back to the goals, did Semianalytica meet them? The answer is yes. So if we go back to sort of for us, the perspective on the goals was very much around being able to interrogate the data really quickly, generate information that can help us do outline business cases, and then sort of expose those really easily to senior managers, senior stakeholders in the business. We hit all of those goals as part of the project. You know, recognizing it was a proof of concept, it still met the goals, and ultimately, basically, it means that we've got a really good, strong base solution to build on, to expand out, to include more properties, a larger estate, and even go beyond what we as a council are responsible for. So that looks at the goals first. So in terms of what does it mean in practice? Well, even though it's proof of concept, we've actually managed to use it on a couple of instances already. So Many of you might be aware of GB Energy, who are now becoming very active in sort of the renewable space, funding new programs and projects. We've used the project already to identify potential schools that show, or at least overlap or align the schools that GB Energy have put forward with our understanding of the data relating to those schools based on the system. So that's been a really good real world example of like actually using the tool in practice on the ground day to day. We've also taken it to sort of our energy boards and our senior sort of directors in this space who are able to really quickly understand the potential for solar at scale across the city, and that's already starting to deliver dividends. So that was just from a very small number of properties that have been fed into the system in detail, but that's very much the baseline for us to work forward. So I think that talks about what we've done in practice. And I think where we go from here, for us, there's a real strength in the tool being deployed across all of our assets. So we need to get all of our assets in there first. As I say, it was a proof of concept, so we only put 20 odd assets in there, but with detail attached to it. But the next step will be getting all of our built assets in there, and then using some of the AI functionality to almost learn from the 20 properties where we have detailed design plans, detailed energy data attached to them, and apply that to the remaining properties. So at least we can get an idea without having to go to REBA 2 stage off, REBA 2, 3 or 4, to understand the potential for decarbing and energy saving and cost saving those properties when it comes to energy usage, without having to go heavily into the detail. And then that can then be the basis for more detailed studies. So that's the first bit in terms of the next level of the tool. And the next bit also is the fact that we've shared proof of concept with several of the local authorities in the North East Combined Authority who've shown some real interest in it. So for us, it's about taking that tool beyond just Newcastle and actually spreading it across the region so others can use it. I think that's the second bit. And I suppose the third bit that I'd be remiss not to mention is the fact that obviously the whole concepts around net zero climate is getting a kicking from a political perspective. But actually, when you look down to the pounds and pence, especially at commercial property level, where we've got large roof spaces, which with good roofs, there's a whole complexity around quality of roof. For us, it's you could actually, and it's a bit bad for me as a climate specialist to say this, you could actually set aside the climate and emissions factors and just focus purely on the energy piece. And that's one of the bits we're really doing as well, focusing quite a lot on the energy savings, cost savings of these interventions, because one of the key focuses we've got as part of our net zero board where we report quarterly is we're showing to our senior decision makers that these investments do deliver savings. Solar combined with battery storage, combined with a heat pump in the right settings with insulation and all those other things, deliver real cost savings that mainly 99 times out of 100, and I always have to caveat, will pay back the initial investment over the initial maybe 10 years, and then you've then got a couple of, usually about 15 for solar on top of that, where it's sort of just generating income for that building. Obviously that's not the same for all buildings, but that bit's really important, and this tool really helps us cut through that narrative, make that narrative a lot clearer, and cut through a lot of the pessimism around sort of deploying solutions on the ground. So yeah, that's a little bit about where we're going from here really. So yeah, I think we're on to questions now, aren't we, Joe and Peter?
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, David and Joe. So many useful insights in that. And yes, it would be great at this point to delve into that a little bit more deeply. And maybe as a first question, David, you've touched a little bit on this, but in a sense, you've shown that AI used in an appropriate way at a local business case can deliver real world value. What I'd be interested to know from you is, let's say there's another city that's thinking of going on this journey. how is it that you managed to use a proof of concept or a pilot, for another term, to in a sense de-risk this from your side, make it that much easier to be brave and try something new?
I think when we spoke about it, people got it on paper. They understood the benefit of the tool. They understood what it could do. But as always with these things, the proof of concept helps demonstrate the value in the real time. So, it helped us sit down with senior managers to get their view in terms of the potential for decarb. It helped them immerse themselves in like the energy saving and the cost saving potential much more than a spreadsheet or a document pack around designs would do. And I think that was the real strength of the proof of concept, and because it meant that others could we could give loggings to others in the business so they could play around with it and get their hands on the data, understand the data, and sort of run their own scenarios. It just meant they could be immersed in the data so much more and understood. Almost they had more buy-in because they got, when we said, oh, let's put solar on these buildings, they got the savings potential and they got the long-term impacts in terms of the benefits. Whereas you could do that on a spreadsheet, but you have to run the scenarios, you'd have to, I don't know, retool the spreadsheet multiple times, and it's just a little bit clunky. Whereas this enabled for people to get into the data, play around with it, and even at senior level, just get a sense of the potential by simple graphs generated by scenarios that are being run.
Brilliant, David. I think, there's definitely something about making it easy for people to understand how a new innovation or approach might help. But with that in mind, and just before we hand over to Joe for some questions, looking back at what you've achieved so far, is there anything that you would do differently now?
I think for us, the bit that we might do differently, as always with these things, half the challenge is stakeholder engagement, and we involve stakeholders at the start and during the project. It was a very quick project. I think it only took us maybe 8 to 10 weeks to develop the proof of concept, get the data in there. But I think what we might have done differently next time is almost involved all of the Northeast local authorities from the very, very, very start, so that they could start feeding in their thoughts and potential sites, not necessarily to sort of feed in the data, because it was a time limited, geographically limited proof of concept, but having had them on the journey at the start might have made selling the tool a bit easier to them later on in the journey. I'm not saying it's difficult, but I think it's always, if you've seen the journey, seen the value, seen how it fits with buildings from a deployment perspective at the start, you're probably more likely you're going to find the sort of selling internally to your other officers a bit easier later down in the process. So I think the stakeholder engagement bit is really important for us and a key learning.
No, thank you, David. And I think that it's always a bit of a challenge trying to balance keeping everybody involved, but also keeping the right people involved so that the project still goes ahead as quickly as possible. And whether that's at a local or regional scale or cross department, it's a question that comes up at the start of most proof of concept pilot type initiatives. So, but I think with that in mind, Joe, I'd like to bring you in because you've worked with Newcastle, you've also worked with many other cities as Sim Analytica, and what would be interesting to get a sense from you is what makes the pilot with Newcastle unique or proof of concept, and how might it shape your approach working with Newcastle or possibly other cities going forward?
Yeah, good question. So I think the first thing I would say is how on it Newcastle were with the data they had available. So David touched on, we used a subset of properties to begin with, but the quality of the data was just there from the start. Obviously, we had to transform that data, bring it into our platform, but it didn't matter what question we had about the data. David or the wider team could answer the questions that we had of that data. So it was just really refreshing to come in and not be confused about what some stuff meant, or if we were, we knew exactly who we could go and speak to immediately to get an answer to that question. And it just meant the actual iteration on building the tool was so quick. So there might have been a new KPI we wanted to expose. We could then go and sanity check that with David and his team and then come back and understand exactly how we can implement it. So moving forward, I think it would just be making sure we can surface as much information around data or the requirements as possible upfront, or just trying to have a level set of where are you quite right now? What data do you have available? How much do you know about that data? How are you currently using that data?
I think you make a really interesting point there, Joe, just about, in a sense, it's not so much following the money, it's following the data. So find the quality data and see what you can do with that first.
Yeah.
And David, I really liked your, in a sense, linking. You've got 126 buildings, I think you said, but you started with 20, and now you have this opportunity to use those 20 where you have good data to make it that much quicker to understand the next 100. And so, Joe, in a sense, a question that leads from that is, you in your demo, you had your chat to map functionality, where you ask the map to give you an answer. But in a sense, you also over time learning a little bit about what users might want, so the people who use the tool and learning from that. So in the same way that you're able to learn from good data, I'm guessing you're also able to, from a almost user experience point of view, learn how people interact with the tool and make the tool easier to use to reduce that the kind of the pain point of onboarding new people to use a tool. So it'd be good to have you reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So what I will also say just on that as well is people ask questions when you've got a chat-based way of asking questions that you'd never necessarily think of exposing within the tool otherwise. So I think that's one point, just understanding the kind of questions people ask. When you're limited to the analysis you can do, you will stick to that analysis. If you've got basically an open drawing board of whatever you want to include, the amount of questions that we get back is really interesting to look at. And then we even surfaced a few of those with the tool as well. So understanding on how we double click on a specific property, that was partly down to the questions that David and his team were asking. So rather than us just showing the consumption for the specific KPI, can we show all of it in one go back onto the map, etc.?
Brilliant. No, I think there's definitely something to be said about learning from both the data and the users, that bringing those together in a tool. And with that in mind, David, you touched a little bit about how maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, you use the tool with internal advocacy, making senior managers that much more comfortable with the opportunity. But I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit about that, and maybe even how you might use this tool to bring in some of the private sector, who might own buildings alongside your buildings, to get a richer picture of how Newcastle performs.
Well, I think that's the key point that you've hit the nail on the head there, Peter, in terms of the question. I sort of alluded to the fact that funding earlier on has been cut in this space. I recognise the government has lots of different priorities, so it's not necessarily criticism of the government, but we are where we are in terms of funding. But that means we're having to look at different ways to secure funding. And part of that is almost like pulling together a package of potential investable projects at a city scale, whether they be purely public sector or actually private sector buildings that are adjoining to or nearby, and whether that might be via heat network sort of expansion or solar at scale expansion or grid upgrades sort of requirements at a local level. The key is with this tool is by exposing the data in the right format, in the right way, and being able to geospatially package together sites in areas, it helps you then sort of develop almost like portfolios of investable things. And once you've got that portfolio, you can then decide whether you choose to try and secure funding via a government funding route or a borrowing route, or just basically coming to an agreement with the private sector, providing they can get their right return on their investment. So that was a really important part of it. And I think the tool enables us, to give those potential stakeholders sight of the potentials of the properties and how they might all gel together in portfolios of investable assets. So that's the first bit. And I think the second bit, that was really important for internal stakeholders, because we start those internal conversations by saying there is no further grant funding available. So that either leaves you not doing anything, or leave you looking at different funding mechanisms. And by being able to package properties together from a portfolio perspective, it helped our senior stakeholders in the business understand the potential of the estate in terms of actually from an energy saving perspective, from a cost saving perspective, and even from an income generation perspective. And that was a key point, that the tools really enabled that conversation to happen.
Brilliant, David. So if I'm to summarize, it made it that much easier to not even answer difficult questions, but to know which questions to ask in the first place, about how you see buildings, how you pull them together.
Exactly.
I do have one tricky question for you, because you mentioned policy and funding arrangements changing, and in a sense, national priorities changing about how we use buildings. I often have conversations with local authorities in the UK who want to try and figure out which buildings they redevelop, which ones maybe they sell on, or possibly even which ones they demolish. And there's some really difficult questions about when do you retrofit, when do you redevelop, and that'd be good to get a sense of, do you feel this data makes that aspect of it a little bit easier?
I think it makes it a bit easier to conceptualize the urban space. For us as an urban city, we have a little bit of rural right on the outskirts, pretty much where you head towards the airport. So northwest, yeah. But by being able to use the data to understand the urban landscape better and the potential of decarb or energy generation, it does feed into the conversation. It does help phrase those investment conversations, specifically when we start working with our city partners and have conversations about how can we work with them to decarbonize or change how we deploy energy infrastructure. So heat networks is a really good example. We know the legislation on heat networks is changing. It comes in from next year. And we already have a heat network in the city, but our ambition is, as part of the zoning, to expand more on it. And being able to see the data in this way, geospatially, looking at, we mashed together data sources around gas usage. So it shows the potential for getting buildings off gas and effectively connecting to heat networks. Packaging those together at a city scale with partners, with other businesses, does help in terms of some of those sort of urban city centre redevelopment conversations. It's not the only thing, of course. There's a lot going on in the city around blue and green infrastructure and the like. So yeah, it does help. And I think the policy space is really important. Obviously, we've got most of the UK as local elections next year, so there'll be political change there. But we seem to still be getting sucked into this argument and discussion that we're almost assessing the government when we've still got another 3 or 4 years until the next election, and the policy space is largely set. There might be some things moving around at a high level. So in many ways, we've got that policy stability. We might not necessarily have the funding stability, but we've got the policy stability. So it all feeds into it. This data, these tools do feed in. They do help.
No, brilliant, David. And I think you raised something really interesting there about, district heating, their new policies coming in next year. And there's no way of knowing exactly what that's going to look like. But because you've got a tool in place, you could probably be ahead of the game and model it very quickly when it comes in, and potentially be near the front of the pack when it comes to a potential funding decision, which is potentially quite exciting. I've got one last question for both of you, actually, which is, if you were to think about this proof of concept, and you could wave a magic wand and it could solve one more problem that it currently doesn't, what would it be? And maybe, Joe, we'll start with you from the more technical side.
Sure. I think so. Me and David have quite a lot of chats around where we could go next with this. I think one of the interesting ones would be looking at how we expand on the feasibility side. So how do we start bringing in, say, the energy grid data? How do we make sure these interventions we're installing, does the grid currently have capacity? If we're looking at replacing, say, gas consumption with electricity consumption, can the grid actually support that? If we're installing, say, solar PV on top of buildings, can we actually sell back to the grid, and can the grid support it? Can we look at the local grid? Can we look at the local substations? Do we need to get up front before we can make these interventions and actually upgrade the grid as well? I think that's where I would say like a big value add would be. And then David's over to you. What would you say?
I think for me, this goes back to that next step of taking it to the next level. Imagine if tomorrow in the Northeast we had all the 7 local authorities with using the tool and effectively pressing the button and generating a portfolio of 10, 15 sites per local authority grouped together across the region. That is so much more of like an investable proposition for the Northeast, engaging with someone who is looking at building big in the energy sector and growing a capability. That for me will be the big win from all of this, sort of the magic wand moment. If we did that and we would then have those negotiations. Obviously, we'd have to go through the proper process, of course, but negotiations with someone big in the energy space wanting to sort of deploy at scale over those areas. And, you know, we know energy at scale or deployment at scale is where the savings are. You know, having a massive portfolio like that across the region of investable energy assets that at a local authority level, but it could be at a city level, where the money flows in, investment in the region, more jobs, more green spaces. I do sound like a little bit like a salesman, but it's exactly what we're trying to do here. That for me is the magic wand moment of like scaling up for it to be meaningful across the region, and potentially across the north. Get some more money in the north. It's you know, always the mantra that we need to be doing. You know, Joe's a fellow northerner in Leeds, so you know, more money in the north is always good. Apologies if any southerners are on the call. You've got quite a lot of money. We want some up here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. We've got one question from the audience, well, actually 3, from Carolina, which, given that we end, I'm going to very quickly try and just give some attention to. So the first one is, you know, what prevents cities and places from using AI to analyze data? So, I mean, I'd say from my side and from the conversation, it's that quality is probably the biggest issue, and then the second is integration. How do you make sure that you can use all the stuff that exists within a local place? But questions for, I think, for David is, you know, how did you make the argument to finance this? You know, if another city wants to convince, you know, the money holders, how did you make that argument for cost saving up front?
Basics. Start with a proof of concept, and I know Joe and Joe's manager and Joe's CEO are sort of ongoing conversations with us about how do we expand it beyond that proof of concept, and those conversations are going really well. But the proof of concept piece is the key. So, you know, making sure you ask for a small amount first, demonstrate the proof of concept, demonstrate the value, and it helps with the funding further down the line. Of course, you've got to find that first bit of money, and we were fortunate that we could draw on a couple of other sources beyond just the council. But yeah, the proof of concept's key to lubricating the funding wheels, basically.
Brilliant. And I think just your last question, Caroline, about how can more cities be involved? I think some of it is about asking questions and being brave. You know, so Newcastle and St. Analytica had a conversation, found a solution, and you know, you can definitely have a follow-up conversation with St. Analytica. And the next slide that we've got is actually, I'll hand over to Joe in a moment. It's just an opportunity to test how some of this might work, to be comfortable with it. I'd say also reach out to cities that have been brave in a sense. So I'm sure David would be willing to have a conversation, you know, with other cities on the call about how Newcastle has made this work, particularly if you're in the north, because he wants money to flow there. But if you're in the south too, I'm sure he'll talk to you, or the Midlands. So Joe, just over to you very briefly.
Yeah, sure. So if anyone is interested, always happy to have a chat, whether it's me, reach out on the website, feel free to get in touch and we can explore how you can get involved with this, whether it's with myself, whether it's with David as well, to expand a bit on the use cases. But we've also just got a link here as well. So we ran over some super quick demos in this call. This is just like an exploratory piece that we've got out there as well. If you want to start playing around with how you ask questions in a map-based solution, this QR code here will basically take you up. You can sign up. It's completely free. Have a play with it, ask some questions, see what you come up with, and then get back to us as well. What works, what doesn't work, and yeah, just have a play. We can also, if you've not got anything to scan a QR code, we can circulate a link afterwards as well, so you can access it however's best for you.
Yeah, and we will share a link to this, both the video and to the chat to map. So I'd just like to thank David and Joe for sharing your insights so openly today. I've certainly learned a lot. Thank you to our audience for joining, both live and the audience who will watch this post-event. Thank you for that. Just finally, so Babel regularly hosts webinars to try and bring innovation actors closer to cities like this one. So if you want to keep join our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll very happily have you at our next one. So thank you so much for joining today, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.